Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words about net zero and the book I've written on the subject. The climate change challenge is something which I think everybody understands, and there can be very few people who doubt that we're already seeing quite a lot of global warming. Indeed, by 2025, there's about a 40% chance that we'll already have crossed 1.5 degrees warming, and we're well north of 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. I think what people don't perhaps understand quite so fully is what it means to have committed ourselves unilaterally as a country to a net zero carbon production emissions territorial target. I spell all that out because it's not the case that when we get to net zero, if we do, that we will stop causing climate change, as the Climate Change Committee apparently claims we will have done, because carbon territorial emissions production does not measure our carbon footprint. What measures our carbon footprint is our carbon consumption. It's what you and I consume, and it's carbon content that counts. And this is not just some neat little academic point. It's pretty fundamental. And the way to reflect that, as I do in my book, is to look back over the last 30 years and ask oneself the simple question: have we achieved anything at all after trying for 30 years to address climate change? And if the question is really, have we stopped contributing to the growth of the carbon consumption and the carbon concentration in the atmosphere, the answer is very sadly no. Every single year since 1990, the world has added 2 parts per million to the totality of carbon in the atmosphere, say well past 400 parts per million. And just in case you're in any doubt and thinking, well, this is, that's the past and it's all fine now. Last year, during the coronavirus lockdowns, simultaneously across most of the developed world, we added another 2 parts per million. So if you think that net zero means that you, and indeed we, will no longer be causing climate change, think again. And this matters because when you translate that carbon consumption picture into the kinds of decisions that you and I have to make, we need to start off by recognizing that you and I are the polluters. It's our consumption that those oil companies and all those other people that the activists like to victimize or at least criticize, they're doing it for us. You and I fill up the car with petrol. You and I buy fashionable clothes, perhaps, probably less so in my case. You and I buy shoes, food from all over the world, loads of stuff delivered to our door in packaging, and so on and so forth. The translation of the fact that the world is, in energy terms, 80% dependent on fossil fuels is that you and I are probably pretty close to 80% dependent on fossil fuels too. So what do we do if we genuinely no longer want to cause climate change and we genuinely want net zero to mean what I think we think it means, and that is that we're not causing any more climate change? So the answer to that question is that we need to ruthlessly focus upon our carbon consumption. And in my book, I have several parts to this. One is to say it means we, the polluters, must pay, and that means there must be carbon prices and, critically, carbon border adjustments. And it means that you and I must look deeply into our own personal carbon diaries to see how we can change our ways for the better. So let's start with that carbon pricing. Okay. If something isn't priced, it's probably the case that we won't take much notice of it and we'll carry on as we were before. If we pay the cost of our pollution, we have a really big incentive to change our ways. It's true that it's going to make us worse off. We are living beyond our sustainable means. we are over consuming relative to the true costs of the things that we consume. Any rubbish about cakeism and the idea that you can decarbonise and it's not going to cost you anything is just nonsense. Okay, it's derives from this observation about living beyond our means. We are, if we had to pay the true cost of what we are up to, that 80% of fossil fuels in the energy mix and all the energy implied by that we consume, you and I would exhaust a lot more of our household budgets than we currently do. So we should pay, and we should pay irrespective of where the goods and services we buy come from. Doesn't matter a damn to climate change whether the steel that goes into the cars and all sorts of other things that we might consume is made in China or made here. It doesn't matter whether the emissions from raising beef come in the UK or in Brazil or Argentina. They're just emissions. The world knows no boundaries for carbon. It just doesn't matter where it's emitted. It all goes up in that atmosphere and adds to parts per million. So we need to ensure that not only stuff produced in Britain pays a carbon price, but imports do. And if you really think that through, you'll realise that much of the great dash for globalisation has been on the back of not paying proper pricing for the pollution we cause. So that's one bit. And it might sound a bit negative, but the truth is we should face the consequence of our actions. The second side of this is what we really can positively do in our carbon diary. So I suggest that in my book that everyone should sit down and just try and construct roughly what carbon they think is involved in their daily activities, from getting up in the morning and flushing the loo and the energy that goes into that and the paper you might use as loo paper, through to the breakfast cereals which may come from cut down palm oil, rainforests use palm oil in, say, Malaysia or Thailand, through to the fuel in the transport we use to get to work, through to the shoes and the clothes we buy and all that kind of stuff. And you'll rapidly realise that to get to a world where you're not causing any more climate change involves the elimination of nearly all that carbon in your diary. Then you'll get serious and you'll realise what's really involved. And that brings us to transport, which I know you're particularly interested in. And we have real choices here. The first choice is whether to travel at all. Why do we need to travel everywhere? Why do we all have to go on aeroplanes all over the place? I've stopped flying, or almost stopped flying, and that in itself is just one small reduction in the hypocrisy that we all have when it comes to addressing climate change. But how do I get to work? Do I use public transport rather than private transport? Do I really believe that buying an electric car will solve the problem? Really? Have you ever worked out how much carbon is involved in an electric car? It may, after say 60 or 70,000 miles, be carbon better than a conventional small petrol car, but it's a matter of relatives, not absolutes. Could I cycle? Could I walk? And I think that when you do that and you work out what choices you ought to make, you'll realise that we as a society ought to make some pretty powerful choices about public transport and public transport systems. And probably you share with me the difficulty of using public transport, that it's not very well provided. There ain't much of it, it isn't very conveniently placed, and it isn't really designed to enable the country to decarbonise. It's designed to deal with some commuting problems, and particularly with regard to cities. But it can make a great difference. You don't have to go on an internal flight to Glasgow from London. You can get on a train. That makes quite a difference. So if you really look at your personal diary and you analyse all the carbon, and you do a subset of that, which is all the transport carbon you cause, you can make a difference. And the fact is, if we do want to be net zero, we all have to have net zero carbon consumption. And that, dare I say, is a hell of a lot more demanding than pretending like cakeism that it's all just a matter of building some more wind turbines and solar panels, good though that may be, and buying an electric car and, hey, it's all done. Not a bit of it. A lot of those old-fashioned arguments about public versus private transport, about minimising the impact of that transport, come home to roost. Hey, and you might just try going on a bicycle instead. I hope those comments help. I hope they're optimistic in the end that we can tackle these problems, and I hope they contribute to your conference. Thank you very much.